In April 1346, the air outside Caffa smelled of salt and rot. The Mongol siege camp stretched across the hills above the Genoese trading fortress, a city of felt tents and horse dung. Thousands of warriors waited, their horses grazed on the dry grass of the Crimean peninsula. Their Khan, Jani Beg, had sworn to starve the merchants inside the stone walls. But on the edge of the camp, near the grain stores, a black rat crept from a barrel. It had travelled from somewhere far east, perhaps from the shores of Lake Issyk-Kul. Its fur teemed with fleas. One flea, Xenopsilla chopis, carried a bacillus in its gut. The rat's body heat had kept the bacteria alive. The rat died in the morning. The flea, hungry for blood, hopped onto the leg of a sleeping Mongol soldier. The bite was small. A red welt appeared on his ankle. He scratched it in his sleep and thought nothing of it. By nightfall, his groin began to swell. He shivered. He vomited. No one in the camp noticed the pattern. One sick soldier was a bad stomach. 2 were a curse. A dozen meant something worse. But this single bite, delivered on an April afternoon, had just planted the seed of a plague that would tear the Golden Horde apart. The soldier died 3 days later. His tent mates burned his body and his bedding. They did not see the fleas that had already jumped to the next man, to the next rat, to the grain sacks, to the horses. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was too late. The empire of the steppe was already bleeding from the inside. Khan Jani Beg was not an old man in 1346. He had taken the throne of the Golden Horde 4 years earlier, in 1342. After the death of his father, Oz Beg Khan, the succession had been bloody, as it always was in the Mongol world. Jani Beg had his own brothers killed to secure his rule. But once the throne was his, the horde stretched from the Danube River in the west to Siberia in the east. No power in Eastern Europe could stand against him. The siege of Caffa was his greatest campaign. The city was a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean coast, a walled fortress of stone and timber. It held the keys to the Black Sea trade. Jani Beg wanted it badly. He arrived in 1343 with an army of perhaps 20,000 men, mounted archers and siege engineers. He brought trebuchets, great wooden machines that could hurl stones over the walls. He ordered a blockade of the harbour. No ship entered, no ship left. The first year of the siege accomplished little. The Genoese were well supplied. They had food, water, and crossbows. Jani Beg tried to negotiate a truce in 1345, but the talks broke down. The Genoese would not surrender, and Jani Beg would not accept less than full submission. So the siege ground on into its 3rd year. Jani Beg watched from his tent on the hill, surrounded by his generals and his guards. He believed his army was unbreakable. He was the Khan of the Golden Horde, descended from Genghis Khan. No disease, no hunger, no storm could defeat the Mongols. But he was wrong. By late summer 1346, the Mongol camp had become a place of horror. The first cases had appeared in April, a few men with swollen groins and fevers. The camp healers called it a pestilence from the east. They bled the sick and prayed to Tengri. But the disease spread faster than any cure. The symptoms were unmistakable. A man would feel a sudden chill. His temperature would spike. Dark buboes would swell in his armpits or his thighs, hard and painful to the touch. Black spots appeared on his skin. Then came the delirium, the vomiting of blood, and finally death. Most died within 5 days. The Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, who recorded the siege from inside Caffa, wrote that the whole Mongol army was infected and that death reigned everywhere. The rats carried the plague from tent to tent. The fleas jumped from the rats to the men to the grain stores. Thousands of Mongol warriors died each week. The camp became a graveyard of rotting bodies. Jani Beg watched from his command tent. He saw the smoke of funeral pyres rising day and night. He heard the wailing of widows and the coughing of the dying. His army, the pride of the Golden Horde, was dissolving in front of his eyes. No enemy arrow had done this. No Genoese sortie. Only an invisible enemy that moved in the shadows, in the fur of rats, in the bite of a flea. He could not fight what he could not see. Desperation began to take hold. The Khan, who had never lost a battle, was about to lose everything. Jani Beg made his decision in the first week of October 1346. He called his commanders to his tent. The air smelled of smoke and rot. His generals stood with their heads bowed. They had lost half the army to an enemy they could not name. The siege of Caffa was failing. The Genoese walls still stood, and inside those walls, the merchants laughed at the dying Mongols. Jani Beg gave the order. He told his men to collect the bodies of their dead, the plague victims who had swollen and blackened and bled from every pore. He ordered the trebuchets turned not against the stone walls but over them. He commanded his engineers to load the corpses into the throwing arms and hurl them into the city. The trebuchets groaned. The bodies arced through the autumn sky. They fell over the walls and landed in the streets of Caffa. One body struck a market stall. Another splattered against a church door. The Genoese watched in horror as the dead came flying. They did not understand what they saw. They dragged the corpses to the shore and dumped them into the sea, but it was too late. The rats inside Caffa had already found the bodies. The fleas had already jumped. The plague erupted inside the walls within days. The Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi wrote that the rotting bodies left the city a charnel house. He described how the Genoese fell sick with the same swellings and black spots. They died in their houses and in the streets. The defenders who had laughed at the Mongol collapse now faced the same invisible enemy. Jani Beg had not broken the walls with stones. He had broken the city with death itself. The Genoese merchants of Caffa did not wait for the siege to end. In December 1346, with plague burning through their own ranks, they abandoned the city. They loaded a dozen galleys with their goods and their families. They did not know they were also loading cargo that no one could see. Black rats had nested in the holds from the first day of the siege. Fleas clung to their fur. The rats had fed on the plague corpses. Now they sailed with the merchants into the Mediterranean. 4 galleys turned south toward Constantinople. They arrived in January 1347. Within weeks, the plague appeared in the imperial capital. Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzene watched his son die of the disease. He wrote later that the ships had brought the pestilence. The rats had come ashore. Constantinople became a city of the dead. 8 other galleys from Caffa sailed west towards Sicily and Genoa. One ship landed in Messina in February 1347. The Sicilians saw that the sailors were sick. They drove them from the harbour, but the rats had already left the ship. The plague spread through Messina faster than it had through any Mongol camp. The speed astonished everyone. Over land, the plague had crawled at the pace of a man walking. Over sea, it leaped from port to port in weeks. The ships that carried death moved faster than the news of their own arrival. By March 1347, plague had reached Genoa. By April, it was in Marseille. The flea that had bitten a Mongol soldier outside Caffa in the spring of 1346 was now riding the trade routes of the Mediterranean. From Marseille, the plague exploded inland. It did not crawl, it burned. By the autumn of 1347, it had reached the cities of northern Italy. Florence was struck in the spring of 1348. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio lived through it. He recorded that the sick coughed blood, that the dead were piled in carts, that people abandoned their own families. He wrote the Decameron as a testament to the horror, a story of 10 people hiding in a villa while the plague consumed the world around them. The plague reached England in June 1348. It landed at the port of Bristol. The English chronicler Henry Knighton wrote that nearly the whole population of the town died. He described animals roaming wild because there was no one to tend them. The plague spread north and west. It reached London by the autumn. By 1349, it had crossed into Scotland and Ireland. It did not stop. It moved from France to Germany to Scandinavia. The great cities of Europe emptied. The fields went unharvested. The dead outnumbered the living. The numbers are staggering. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed between 30 and 50% of Europe's population. In total, 75 to 200 million people died across Eurasia. The death toll of the Mongol conquests, terrible as they were, was far smaller. The flea that bit one soldier outside Caffa had unleashed something that no army could match. The Mongol Empire was forgotten in the chaos, while Europe burned. The Golden Horde dissolved. Jani Beg would die in 1357, murdered by his own son in a struggle for a throne that no longer ruled anything. The Mongol camp outside Caffa fell silent in early 1347. Not the silence of a lull in battle, the silence of abandonment, of death. The survivors left in small groups at first. Then they left in larger groups. They did not ask permission. They simply walked away from the siege lines. They left their dead unburied. They left their tents standing. They left the rotting corpses of their horses. Jani Beg watched them go. He had no authority to stop them. The plague had taken his authority. It had taken everything. The siege of Caffa lifted without ceremony. No surrender, no treaty. The Genoese merchants simply looked out one morning and saw that the Mongols were gone. They did not celebrate. They had too many of their own dead to bury. But they did not linger. They boarded their ships. They sailed for home. They carried the rats with them. The rats carried the fleas. The fleas carried the plague. Europe would burn for the next 4 years. Jani Beg retreated to Sarai, his capital on the Volga. He tried to rebuild, but the plague had not spared his family. His wives died. His children died. His generals died. The steppe emptied. Entire Ulysses, the tribal divisions of the Mongol Empire, simply ceased to exist. The Russian chronicles note that in some regions no one remained to bury the dead. The grass grew over the yurt circles. The herds scattered. The old men who remembered the great conquests died alone in empty pastures. Jani Beg held on for a decade, but the Golden Horde never recovered. In 1357, his son Berdi Beg decided that even a ruined Khanate was better than waiting for his father to die naturally. He murdered Jani Beg in his tent. One account says he did it with his own hands. A single blow. A single death. The man who had once commanded the most powerful army in Eastern Europe fell in the dirt of his own camp. Berdi Beg took the throne. He held it for 2 years. Then he was murdered by his own brother. The pattern repeated for a decade. Khan after Khan, murder after murder. The Golden Horde fragmented into warring factions. The great empire of the steppes became a patchwork of petty warlords. The plague did not stop at the Volga. It kept moving east. It followed the old Silk Road. It followed the trade routes. It followed the caravans that carried silk and spices and ideas. In 1348, it reached Tabriz in Persia. The city had been the capital of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol kingdom that ruled Persia and Iraq. But the Ilkhanate was already dying when the plague arrived. The last effective ruler, Abu Sa'id, had died without an heir in 1335. His death triggered a civil war. Factions fought over a throne that no longer commanded loyalty. The plague finished what the civil war had started. Tabriz emptied. The Persian historian Hamdallah Mustafi wrote that the city lost most of its population. The workshops closed. The markets went silent. The irrigation canals fell into disrepair. The countryside depopulated. Villages that had stood for centuries became ghost towns. The plague did not discriminate. It killed Mongols and Persians alike. It killed rich merchants and poor farmers. It killed scholars and soldiers. The Ilkhanate collapsed into regional lordships. No one had the population or the resources to reunite it. The plague moved further east. It reached Samarkand in Central Asia by 1348. It reached the cities of the Chagatai Khanate, the Mongol realm that stretched from the Aral Sea to the Altai Mountains. The Chagatai Khans had already been weakened by internal conflicts. The plague destroyed what strength remained. Trade stopped. The caravans stopped coming. The cities shrank. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented into tribal confederations that fought each other for control of empty pastures. Even the Yuan dynasty in China felt the blow. The plague arrived in the 1350s. The Chinese chronicles record devastating outbreaks in the provinces of Hubei and Zhejiang. Entire counties lost half their population. The Yuan government, already struggling with corruption and rebellion, could not respond. The plague accelerated its decline. The Mongols who had conquered China could no longer hold it. A rebel leader named Zhu Yunzang began to unite the southern provinces. The Yuan writ no longer extended beyond the capital. The plague broke the Mongol system. It did not break the world. New powers rose to fill the empty space. In Eastern Europe, the Grand Duchy of Moscow had been a vassal of the Golden Horde for more than a century. The Russian princes paid tribute. They kissed the Khan's ring. They sent their sons as hostages. But the Golden Horde after Jani Beg could no longer enforce its demands. The tribute stopped arriving. The Mongol tax collectors stopped coming. The Russian princes began to act as if the Khan no longer existed. In 1380, Prince Dmitry of Moscow led a coalition of Russian forces against the Mongol warlord Mamai at Kulikov Field. The battle was not decisive. The Russians won the field but lost many men. Another Mongol army burned Moscow 2 years later. But the psychology had shifted. For the first time, a Russian prince had openly defied the horde and survived. Muscovy gathered strength in the decades that followed. The tribute never fully resumed. The Golden Horde never recovered the authority it had lost. Moscow would eventually claim the legacy of the fallen empire. In the Balkans, the Ottoman Turks seized their moment. They had been a small beylik in Anatolia, a frontier state pressing against the crumbling Byzantine Empire. The plague weakened everyone around them. It weakened the Byzantines. It weakened the Bulgarian and Serbian kingdoms. It weakened the Mongol Ilkhanate. The Ottomans crossed into Europe in 1354. They captured Gallipoli. They expanded into Thrace. They took Adrianople in 1369. The city became their new capital. The Ottoman advance into the Balkans would reshape the region for centuries. In China, Zhu Yuanzhang declared himself emperor of the Ming dynasty in 1368. He captured Dadu, the Mongol capital. The Yuan emperor fled north into the steppes. The Mongol rule of China ended after 97 years. The flea that bit a soldier outside Caffa had done what the Chinese rebels could not. It had broken the Mongol grip on the richest empire in the world. The flea's legacy was not just death, it was a new world. That flea, a speck of kitten on a black rat, bit a Mongol soldier outside Caffa in the spring of 1346. The soldier may have scratched the welt and felt nothing worse than an itch. He likely died within a week, his lymph nodes swollen into buboes, his skin blackened with hemorrhages. That single bite did not cause the pandemic. The plague already existed in the wild rodent populations of Central Asia, but that bite was the first link in a chain that snapped the Mongol Empire. The flea jumped from rat to soldier. The soldier infected his campmates. The camp infected Caffa. The Genoese galleys carried the plague to Constantinople, to Sicily, to Genoa, to every port in the Mediterranean. By 1347, the Black Death burned through Europe. By 1350, a third of the continent lay dead. The Mongols of the Golden Horde died in equal numbers. Khan Jani Beg lost his army, then his throne, then his life in 1357. The horde fractured and never reunited. That same plague spread east along the Silk Road. It weakened the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Yuan dynasty in China. The Mongol House of Cards collapsed. In the vacuum, new powers rose. Moscow shook off tribute. The Ottomans crossed the Dardanelles. The Ming expelled the Mongols from China. The flea had done what no general could achieve. It is a strange lesson. The smallest agent of change is often the most powerful. A rodent, an insect, a single desperate decision by a Khan who catapulted corpses over a wall. The Mongols conquered from the Pacific to the Danube through discipline and terror, but they fell to a creature they could not see, could not fight, could not even name. The bite outside Caffa in 1346 was the rust that brought down the Iron Empire. And the world we live in today, the borders of Europe and Asia, the rise of Russia, the Ottoman footprint, the end of Mongol domination, all of it begins with that one tiny scratch.